Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, there is further evidence of cognitive dysfunction after infection with COVID-19 and that this may carry on for a long time and be far more significant than previously thought. Use of cannabis is linked to increased cardiovascular disease, various businesses and entities cutting ties with medical professionals or removing their right to practice. Egypt creating a genetically modified wheat to cope with salinity and drought, and scientists who are trying to communicate with aliens and have obviously never seen a sci-fi movie where the same thing was attempted. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with COVID-19. It's already been shown in other studies that when you are infected with COVID-19, it may have an impact on many different parts of your body. It can be everything from reproductive ability in the testes, lung function, heart, blood clots, and the brain. The brain has been something more questionable, let's say. The exact cause, the exact mechanism, and how long the effect will last has been uncertain. Some studies have found people infected in the earliest days of the outbreak are still experiencing a decline in cognitive function nearly 2 years later. Others are relatively back to normal, with only minor exceptions. That is where this current study that uses a small cohort, so take it with a considerable amount of salt, comes in. There were 46 severe COVID-19 patients compared to 460 controls. They were trying to understand whether or not infection with severe COVID had an impact 6 months later. What they found is roughly the equivalent of losing 10 IQ points or aging by 20 years. That is a very big impact for something that most people are shrugging off as just a new kind of influenza. We have mentioned in past videos that COVID is likely to be the stimulus that gives rise to a series of long-term, extreme complications in terms of healthcare. Whether that is the increased risk of cardiovascular disease, things like blood clots, myocardial infarction, stroke, and so on. It could be sterility and fertility issues. All of these are likely to show up in increasing numbers over time, all due to the fact that somebody's been infected now. In 20 years' time, we may see that there is a huge impact on the population due to this outbreak, something that we can't predict now. That's why research like this is very important. It gives some context and gives a line of inquiry more support for investigation as to what is happening and will it continue to show effects over the long term. The possible only upside to this study is that the impact on cognitive function was directly related to the severity of infection. This means that only those who were most sick with COVID-19 had the most impact on their mind. This may be somewhat promising for those who had far more mild cases. This is supported by some evidence that there is a reduction in cognitive function even in mild cases, but much less so. Going from COVID-19 to cannabis. Cannabis is, depending on where you are in the world, varying degrees of illegal. In parts of America, it is illegal at a federal level, but legal at a state level. In other countries, it's allowable under a medical prescription. In others again, there's no allowance whatsoever. Despite this, it remains a relatively popular drug to use. That's why an examination, admittedly in an animal model, found that there was some relationship between the use of cannabis, specifically the drug THC within it, and cardiovascular disease. To a certain extent, the study finds that there are similar effects to things like tobacco. We're specifically talking about inflammation in the cells that line blood vessels. This then contributes significantly to the development of atherosclerosis, or plaques in the arteries. These will then either reduce blood flow, or can break free and become a clot, causing blood to stop flowing to something important, like the brain or parts of the heart. This is then supported by cell-based research looking at the same sort of endothelial cells that line blood vessels in humans. They found that there was a similar kind of effect, that is, hardening of the blood vessels. As mentioned, given that there are a number of countries that are making it legal to use for medical reasons and or as a recreational drug, this is a more significant consideration, and will likely to become an increasingly significant consideration. That's why such research is important but not definitive. After all, you can't establish causality entirely based on animal and cell models. This is why they then tested their theory in humans. The volunteers were able to smoke cannabis and had their blood tested. Inflammatory molecules, which indicated the same sort of processes as in the cell and animal models, were found in the volunteers' blood. This means that they can show a series of different experiments, all leading to the same, more or less, conclusive conclusion. That is, cannabis can cause issues with blood vessels, and this poses a legitimate risk. Going from medical news that is, at this stage, preliminary, to something that has been chased for quite some years now. The severance of Columbia University and Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz, as we've previously described, is a modern snake oil salesman. Just about everything that he has on his show, and otherwise tries to get into the public's psyche, is at best questionable, and in some cases can actually be outright harmful. Despite all of that, he's had a continued relationship with Columbia University. Why a university that is well recognized and well respected had such a close association with someone who has specialized in misleading people is beyond us, and why they maintain that relationship for so long is outright bizarre. For years, doctors who are currently practicing and are legitimately trying to do what's best for people have pushed Columbia to cut their ties with Dr. Oz. They're only now doing so. One downside to the way that Columbia has gone about this is that they've effectively purged Dr. Oz from their website in its entirety. Given that he's been involved with them for a number of decades now, it's not uncommon to see that someone so engaged for so long would normally be given the title of emeritus, whether that's professor or similar. This is, to a certain degree, a nod in reflection of their years of service, but also it ensures they can continue having access to things like emails, library databases, can provide teaching if needed, and, somewhat more importantly for academics, continue to conduct some research through that university. In this case, it appears that none of this will be possible, and that they've simply removed him without telling anyone. The article in question goes into a great deal of detail on both his background and possible reasons for this and implications of having done so, and the link to that can be found below. Going to a different doctor this time, but all the way in Canada. In this case, they've been suspended, and this is all because they were providing inappropriate treatments for COVID-19. The doctor was approved to practice, and they were providing care for their community. Admittedly, a somewhat remote community, but still. The doctor's been taken to task over what has been described as disgraceful, dishonourable, or unprofessional conduct, and failed to maintain the standards of practice of the profession. This is largely going to boil down to what he's been posting on social media and other kinds of communication. Most of it regards comparisons between things like vaccinations and other pandemic-related public health measures to authoritarian parties in 1930s, Other cases, it's been claiming that things like vaccine certificates were illegal or that it would deny basic human rights. Some things which are largely untrue. Beyond the hyperbolic claims being made, there are some that can be directly countered with facts and that no medical professional should be making if they either have a basic understanding of the biology of COVID-19 or at least are familiar with the medical system and how it's having to cope with, or in some places not cope, with COVID-19. He made claims like the risks of asymptomatic spread of COVID-19 is negligible or non-existent. This isn't true, but the claims were made. This, along with other things that he said, have been actively dissuading people from following even basic public health measures, such as social distancing, masks, and so on. Then there are more serious matters. For example, interfering with the testing of infants if the parents had COVID-19, reporting adverse events of immunizations when they weren't relevant to the immunizations. Perhaps at the very top of what he was failing to do, beyond what we've already mentioned, is the failure to follow hospital protocols. This is one that could even more seriously endanger not only the patient's lives, but many different patients' lives based on his behavior and how serious a breach of the protocols it was. Imagine if you had a doctor who refused to wash their hands. That would be based on a protocol, and it could easily lead to multiple infections or contamination of multiple different locations with pathogens. Going from medical doctors and professionals who are in the deep end of things to genetics. This is about a particular kind of gene associated with lupus. Lupus is one of the more unusual autoimmune diseases. It's sometimes known as the Great Deceiver or Charlatan and similar names, because it can often be mistaken for any number of other diseases. Because of this, it can be very hard to pin it down. Once you do diagnose it, it can be controlled to a certain extent with immunosuppressants. But the challenge is making that diagnosis. Since just about all diagnoses are made on clinical symptoms, it's one of the reasons why it takes so long. If instead you could rely on a genetic test, you could reduce the number of false positives or false negatives, depending on how you want to view it, and be able to figure out what's happening. This is where the TLR7 gene comes into play. It's found on the X chromosome, which may explain why more women than men have lupus. And if that's the case, it could possibly be one of the strongest indicators that that is what should be diagnosed, if you can run a PCR test and find this gene. Admittedly, all of this is based on a very small sample set and a particular case study where it seems to be an exaggerated form of lupus that responds to a much smaller stimulus and yet exhibits the same effects. Still on the topic of genetics, but switching to another disorder, in this case autism spectrum disorders. In order to be able to understand what happens with autism, we need to both look at the anatomical and physiological changes and the genes that are responsible. The downside to looking at the genetics is that there is a wide gamut of genes that all seem to interact in different ways. It's why no single study can find a single gene responsible for autism. That is until now, where modifying one gene appears to drastically alter the effects of autism. The researchers took cells from people with Pitt-Hopkins syndrome and modified them into stem cells that they could then create brain organoids from. These are properly called brain cortical organoids. They are like a regular brain, but much simpler and much smaller. This allows you to be able to perform experiments with them and have a great deal of the complexity of the human brain without needing the size or all of the ethical issues that go with it. They are still a limited model of the human brain though, so as with most other studies, take this with a considerable amount of salt, as the initial research is a pathway into something more significant. The research itself is a collaboration between the University of Cannabis in Spain and the University of California, San Diego. By focusing on a gene called transcription factor 4, they were able to look at the different ways the brain developed in autism-like scenarios. The reason they're focusing on this gene is that it's involved in managing different parts of the DNA itself, so it prevents or encourages differentiation and changes based on what stimulus the cells get. Since they changed this, they were able to find that different parts of the brain organoid behaved differently when it was turned off and turned on. Largely, it was impairing the ability to diversify and differentiate into different kinds of cells, which are often needed in the brain during its development, especially with young children and fetuses. The advantages to this over other approaches that have been proposed is that it is a single gene, it's something that's much easier to address, and that it does show significant effects in reversing the impact of autism at a physiological and anatomical level. This should in theory then help, largely, with addressing some of the issues around autism, notably things like the uncoordinated motor movements. While genetically modifying children with autism is one thing, and it's certainly ethically far more questionable, genetically modifying things like wheat is far less so, and this is why Egypt is trying to do just that. To be blunt, Egypt is not entirely hospitable to farming. The Nile Delta and parts of the Nile itself can be very productive, but outside of that, you have a lot of sand and very little means of producing any kind of food. In order to make up for that, genetically modifying wheat could be one way of increasing food security for Egypt. The Egyptian Atomic Energy Authority wants to modify it by adding both something to tolerate salinity, which is increased salt in the soil, and to make them more resistant to water scarcity. The field trials show that it can make 4 tons of wheat per an acre, which is about 33% higher than the normal wheat grown, and that it takes 140 days to grow. This means that there's theoretical capacity for 2.6 crops per year. That means every 2 years you can get 5 rounds of this. That is a lot of food to be grown in a small area, assuming that they can continuously cultivate the same places again and again with the same wheat variety. Going from agricultural and biological news to technology-related news, and a weird video that you may or may not have seen. It's come out of China and it shows footage of drones flying through a bamboo forest. What is unusual is that the drones are flying through at both high speed and, to a certain extent, quite well. If this was a controlled drone, none of this would be too surprising. It would be difficult, for sure. After all, the drones are having to fly through rough terrain, and having a pilot be able to respond to everything that occurs is pretty much difficult. Where these drones are special is that they were flying autonomously, that is, no human input. If we're looking at these in terms of what they could mean, think about what benefits there are to being able to fly a drone and have it deliver packages without ever having to have any kind of input. It would very much be what Amazon was trying to do not that long ago, before they realized people were shooting their drones out of the sky. It could be used for search and rescue, conservation efforts, mapping, and more. Next we go from technology and robotics news to astronomy news of a kind. 2 groups of researchers are trying to make contact with aliens in outer space. As we mentioned at the very start, clearly these scientists have never seen a horror movie or sci-fi movie where we actually succeeded in contacting aliens. It rarely ends well. Despite this, they are trying. What they're doing is sending out radio and optical signals, and the hope is that they will eventually be picked up by something else. One team is sending out the radio signal in broad terms and hoping to get lucky. They're using binary code. The second team is using a very specific target and trying to send a laser-like signal straight to it. Their theory is that the planets they're targeting are in the Goldilocks zone and therefore likely to have life. The final news item we have for you this week is something of a showpiece. The Eta Aquariid meteor shower. For those of you who aren't aware, this is a roughly annual event, and it is, as the name suggests, a large meteor shower. If you live in the southern hemisphere, for once, you're going to get the best view of this. That's because, for the most part, events like this tend to occur mostly in the northern hemisphere. Even then, there's a chance that in the northern hemisphere you should be able to see them to some extent. The rough peak for this is between the 4th and 11th of May, although there will hopefully be some slight lead up and trailing off of the shower itself. This means that even if you can't see it in that roughly week-long period, you'll be able to see something before or after it. There is one particular day where it's supposed to be best, and that is somewhere around May 7th. If this sort of event is something that you enjoy seeing, then this is a good opportunity. Although there won't be a great many of these meteorites streaking across Earth, you can at least see some. It'll be roughly 1 every 10 minutes initially, and it may build up to more in the high point, with meteors occurring between every 1 and 2 minutes. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post your comments, questions, or suggestions below.